Normandy, June 1944. The beaches were choking on fire and smoke. Tanks sank in the rising tide. Engines froze, jammed, died one by one under the salt water that poured into their steel lungs. The invasion that would decide the fate of the free world was faltering, not from bullets, but from broken machines. Amid the chaos, one man refused to give up. His name was Harold Keller, a field engineer no one had ever heard of. He wasn't a general or a scientist, just a grease-covered mechanic from Ohio, labeled mad by his own superiors. But in the middle of the world's greatest invasion, Keller did the unthinkable. He built an engine from wreckage, scrap metal, burned parts, anything he could find, and brought an entire armored column back to life. What he created that day wasn't just a machine. It was a miracle of desperation, built in the shadow of death, that helped turn the tide of D-Day. Harold Keller had never wanted to be a soldier. Before the war, he'd spent his days fixing tractors in a quiet Ohio workshop that smelled of oil, grass, and rust. He wasn't educated beyond high school, but he had a mind that saw patterns in chaos, how gears fit, how engines breathed, how machines came alive when no one else believed they could. In 1942, when he was drafted into the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, he brought that same stubborn genius to war. His hands, calloused from farm tools, would soon be covered in the soot of tanks and landing craft instead of plow grease. The Army didn't quite know what to do with him. He wasn't a soldier. He questioned orders, broke regulations, took machines apart when he wasn't supposed to. Some called him reckless, others called him mad. But his commanding officer saw something rare, a man who could turn disaster into invention. Keller wasn't assigned to the front lines. He was sent to the maintenance teams that followed the invasion force. His job was simple: keep the vehicles alive at all costs. When the Allied invasion of Normandy began on June 6, 1944, Keller's team landed just after dawn. What they saw was not the triumphal image captured in newspapers. It was chaos. Burning tanks half buried in sand, trucks split open by shells, landing craft twisted like tin cans. The sound of war was deafening. Gunfire, screaming engines, men shouting through the smoke. The beach was supposed to be cleared in hours. It wasn't. Every minute of mechanical failure cost lives. Keller's first task was to repair an immobilized Sherman tank that had become the linchpin of a stalled column. Its engine, drowned in seawater, refused to start. Without it, the vehicles behind it couldn't move inland. The entire advance risked collapse. Keller crawled under fire toward the machine, bullets hissing through the sand. The engine compartment was a nightmare, soaked, corroded, lifeless. To most mechanics, it was finished. But Keller saw something else: possibility. He shouted for tools that didn't exist: welding torches, spare pistons, clean oil. But there was nothing. The beach was stripped bare. So he did what no manual ever taught him. He began scavenging. He tore apart wrecked landing craft for tubing, pried pistons from destroyed trucks, cut metal plating with a bayonet when no saw was available. Around him, men fought to stay alive. But Keller fought the machine itself, the dead weight of steel that stood between them and victory. For nearly 5 hours he worked in the open, half blind from smoke and grit, using seawater to cool the parts as he welded. His hands blistered from heat, his eyes burned from salt. At one point, an explosion knocked him flat, covering the engine in sand and shrapnel. He wiped it off, coughing, refusing to quit. "If this thing runs," he muttered to himself, "they move. If they move, we win." It became a mantra in the madness. When the sun dipped behind the smoke clouds, Keller pulled the starter. The sound that followed was unlike anything the men had heard all day, a deep, roaring growl that cut through the chaos. Against every expectation, the engine came to life. The tank commander climbed back in disbelief. Keller had rebuilt the heart of a Sherman using scrap and fury. The tank rolled forward, clearing the jam, and the column began to move inland once more. Soldiers cheered, some shouted his name, but Keller barely noticed. He was already moving to the next machine, another lifeless hulk waiting for a miracle. In that moment, under the fire and smoke of Normandy, Harold Keller ceased to be just a mechanic. He became something else, a symbol of human defiance against the impossible. His creation wasn't pretty. It wasn't by the book, but it worked. And on D-Day, that was all that mattered. Word of the mad mechanic spread faster than anyone expected. In the confusion of D-Day's aftermath, soldiers carried stories like smoke. half whispered, half believed. Somewhere on Omaha Beach, they said, a man had built an engine out of wreckage and brought dead tanks roaring back to life. Some dismissed it as battlefield rumor. Others swore they'd seen it themselves. The flames, the scrap, the impossible roar of rebirth in the middle of hell. But for those who were there, it wasn't a legend. It was the sound of hope. In the days that followed, Keller's hands barely stopped moving. The beaches were littered with thousands of machines, broken, burned, or abandoned in the sand. Each one represented not just steel but lives. He moved from wreck to wreck, crawling through mud and smoke, pulling parts that might still breathe. There was no supply line, no replacement stock, no luxury of time. Every piece of metal mattered. Every engine he revived meant troops could move inland, supplies could reach the front, and the invasion could continue. The Army's maintenance doctrine said that damaged equipment should be sent back to depots in England. Keller ignored it. By the book, he told his men, gets us killed. He formed what became known as a Frankenstein crew, a handful of grease-covered engineers and drivers who shared his madness. They welded tank treads from mismatched pieces, used melted-down helmets for patching armor, and turned destroyed half-tracks into field ambulances. They called their creations Keller Specials, machines that looked like nightmares but fought like miracles. His commanding officer, Major Edward Brooks, didn't know whether to court-martial him or promote him. Keller's disobedience was blatant. He cannibalized government property, rewired vehicles beyond recognition, and defied direct orders to retreat from hot zones. But each time he broke the rules, lives were saved. In one instance, he used a wrecked German Panther engine to power an American bulldozer, clearing a path for Allied trucks through a bombed-out village. Mad, the men said again, but always with awe. Still, beneath his rough defiance, Keller carried the weight of every decision. At night, when the fighting paused and the cold set in, he would sit beside the glowing embers of an oil drum, his hands trembling from exhaustion. He thought about the faces of men who didn't make it, those who trusted their lives to the machines he couldn't save. The smell of burned rubber and gasoline haunted him. He was not a hero in his own eyes, just a man trying to make broken things live again. But war has a way of revealing who people truly are. In late June, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Normandy, Keller's unit was ambushed near St. Lo. The road was cratered, the convoy trapped. One of the trucks, loaded with medical supplies, was hit and burst into flames. Inside, an engine still sputtered, half alive. Keller ran toward it through the gunfire, ducking behind twisted metal. A shell exploded nearby, throwing him to the ground. Shrapnel tore through his arm, but he kept crawling, dragging himself toward the dying truck. What he did next would become part of Army legend. With his good hand, he tore open the engine compartment, ripped out the fuel line, and jammed it into a jerry can of spare gas. He struck a flare, igniting the engine just long enough to push the truck off the road, saving the wounded men trapped behind it. The explosion that followed lit the night like dawn. Keller was thrown clear, his uniform shredded, his body burned, but the convoy survived. When they found him hours later, half-conscious and covered in soot, he whispered the same words he'd said on the beach. If they move, we win. It wasn't strategy, it was faith. A belief that every broken thing, given a chance, could live again. After St. Lo, Keller was sent to a field hospital in England. Doctors called him lucky to be alive. He hated the word. While he recovered, his team continued his work, keeping the machines running with the same defiant creativity he had taught them. They signed their repairs with a small mark, a single letter, K, scratched into the steel. It became a symbol across the front, Keller's touch. By the time he returned to the field, the Allies had broken through France. New tanks, trucks, and engines rolled off the ships, shiny and clean, untouched by war. But among the veterans, those flawless machines were nothing compared to the ugly, patched-together beasts that had carried them through Normandy. Those were the machines that bled and survived, the ones that bore Keller's fingerprints. And though few outside his unit knew his name, his impact had already rippled far beyond the beaches. The field repair techniques he invented out of desperation were quietly adopted by engineers across Europe. Improvised workshops sprang up near every front line, fueled not by supplies but by imagination. It was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, One fought not only with bullets, but with brains, grit, and the will to make something out of nothing. By August 1944, France was burning. The Allied advance had pushed deep beyond Normandy, but every mile forward came at a terrible cost. Roads were cratered, bridges blown apart, and convoys stranded in endless columns of smoke and dust. The closer they came to Paris, the harder the war fought back, not just with bullets, but with exhaustion, mud, and machines that couldn't take another mile. For Harold Keller, it was the war's cruelest irony. They were winning on paper, but losing in the details, in the grinding failure of gears, the slow death of engines, the endless hunger for fuel and parts. He had returned to the front with his arm still bandaged and a limp he'd never quite shake. Doctors had told him to rest. Keller refused. "You can't rest when the war still breathes," he said quietly. By now, his name carried a strange gravity among the engineers. He wasn't just the mad mechanic anymore. He was the man they called when nothing else worked. Officers sent broken tanks his way like prayers. His workshop, nothing more than a tent of torn canvas and smoke, became a sanctuary of sparks and miracles. Men who walked in with despair came out believing again. But every success came with a price. Sleep was rare. Food was an afterthought. The line between genius and collapse grew thinner every day. Then came Mortain. August the 7th, 1944. The German counterattack struck like lightning, cutting through Allied lines with Tiger tanks that seemed invincible. American units were pinned, their armor shattered, their engines dead from overwork and shell fire. Keller's team was trapped near a small French village, their supplies gone, their vehicles crippled. The radio crackled with chaos, reports of entire divisions surrounded. Keller moved among the broken machines like a surgeon in a field hospital of steel. The air stank of oil and death. He counted 8 tanks, all dead, all out of time. They couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't flee. The Tigers were advancing. If they didn't escape, they'd be annihilated. "Find me metal," he told his crew. "Anything that bends." They stared at him, disbelieving. The engines were beyond repair. Warped blocks, cracked heads, burned-out bearings. But Keller didn't hear their doubts. He was somewhere else, deep in the fever of creation, where reason no longer mattered. He scavenged parts from a wrecked German tank, hammered them into place with the butt of a rifle, and melted them together using a flamethrower as a makeshift torch. The sound of battle rolled closer, like thunder on the edge of the world. For hours he worked in a frenzy. Smoke rose from the engine bays, sparks flew like fireflies, his wounded arm shaking from strain. "This isn't going to hold," one of his men shouted. Keller didn't look up. "It only has to hold once," he said. As dawn bled across the hills, the first tank coughed, sputtered, and roared. The crew cheered, but Keller was already moving to the next. A second came alive, then a third. They were ghosts of machines, patched with enemy parts, held together by sheer will. But they moved. That was all that mattered. When the Tigers appeared through the mist, Keller's ragged column met them head-on. The improvised engines screamed in protest, the air filled with the smell of burning oil. Shells exploded around them, dirt and steel raining down. But those reawakened tanks did what no one expected. They held. They pushed. They fought. The German assault broke, not because of superior firepower, but because the Americans refused to stay dead. When the smoke cleared, the battlefield was a graveyard of twisted metal, but Keller's machines still rumbled, alive against all odds. After the fight, Keller collapsed beside one of his creations. Its armor was dented, its engine leaking oil like blood. He rested his head against the hull, whispering as if to a living thing. "You did good," he said. "You got them home." The men didn't cheer. They stood in silence, watching him, this broken, burned mechanic who had once been dismissed as insane. They knew in that moment that genius and madness were sometimes the same thing. That survival wasn't about perfection. It was about not giving up when the world says you should. In the following weeks, as Allied forces liberated Paris, Keller's name began to reach higher ears. Reports described unorthodox engineering tactics and field-level miracle repairs. He hated the attention. For him, there was no glory in it, only the memory of men who never came back, and machines that couldn't be saved. He wrote to his wife from a small village workshop. "They call me an inventor. I'm not. I just refuse to let things die before their time." It was the truest sentence he ever wrote. Autumn came to France like a slow exhale. The thunder of invasion faded into the grinding rhythm of occupation and repair. The roads once soaked with blood, now filled with convoys, tanks, and the endless noise of progress. Victory was no longer a dream. It was approaching, tangible, and cold. For most soldiers, it was a promise of going home. For Harold Keller, it was something else. It was the sound of his purpose slipping away. By late 1944, Keller had become an unspoken legend within the Allied ranks. Officers from across Europe sought his counsel. His mad improvisations now studied in field manuals as examples of battlefield innovation. Journalists came looking for him, some to find a hero, others to find a symbol of American ingenuity. But Keller hated interviews. He never saw himself as a hero. "I didn't build legends," he would say quietly. "I built engines." He spent his days in a makeshift hangar outside Paris, where the wrecks of war came to die, or be reborn under his hands. The air was always thick with oil smoke and metal dust. His tools were scattered chaos, his coat burned with holes, his fingers wrapped in cloth. Every soldier who entered that workshop left in awe. They said he could touch a machine and hear what was wrong with it, as if he could listen to the heartbeat of steel. But inside, Keller was breaking. The war had taken more than his strength. It had taken his silence. He couldn't sleep without hearing engines screaming in his dreams. He flinched at the sound of gunfire, even in celebration. His left hand, permanently stiff from burns, made it hard to hold tools for long. Still, he worked. He refused to stop. It wasn't duty anymore. It was obsession. One night, a young private named Lawson came to him in panic. A convoy carrying medical supplies had broken down near the front. The engines were dead, frost freezing the fuel lines. Keller didn't hesitate. He gathered his tools, mounted a jeep, and drove into the black rain. The front was quiet now, too quiet. When he arrived, he saw the trucks lined like corpses in the mud, their headlights flickering weakly. He worked in silence, his breath turning to mist in the cold air. The private watched as Keller stripped one engine apart, then another, his movements methodical but heavy, as if he was fighting the weight of the world with every wrench. The engines coughed one by one until finally they roared again. The convoy moved. The private saluted, but Keller didn't wave back. He just stared at the horizon where the sound of artillery still echoed like a heartbeat that refused to die. When he returned to Paris, there was a letter waiting for him, a commendation from General Eisenhower himself. It praised Keller's extraordinary innovation under combat conditions and recommended him for the Legion of Merit. Most men would have framed it. Keller folded it once and tucked it into the breast pocket of his uniform. "They give medals for surviving," he murmured to a fellow mechanic. "But I didn't come here to survive." That winter was cruel. The Battle of the Bulge erupted in the Ardennes, the last great gamble of the German army. Keller's unit was pulled north, back into the snow and mud, to keep the tanks running as the lines buckled under the enemy assault. Supplies were thin. Fuel was scarce. Temperatures dropped so low that engines froze solid overnight. For weeks, Keller and his crew worked with bare hands, their breath turning to ice, their bodies trembling from cold. One night, after repairing a half-track under enemy artillery fire, Keller collapsed. The medics said his heart was failing from exhaustion and frostbite. He refused evacuation until every vehicle was moving again, when they finally forced him onto a stretcher. He whispered the same words he'd said since Normandy. "If they move, we win." They were his last recorded words before he slipped into unconsciousness. He awoke days later in a hospital near Liège, wrapped in blankets, his tools gone. The war was ending. The Allies had broken through the German lines. Paris was free. Keller stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to the silence that followed victory. For the first time, there was no engine to fix, no broken thing calling his name. And in that silence, he felt something unfamiliar: fear. Because for men like Harold Keller, peace was the one thing they had never been built to survive. After the war, Keller was sent home with honors. But when he stepped off the ship in New York, there was no band, no fanfare, just the quiet hum of a world moving on. The Army offered him a position at a military research facility. He declined. He went back to Ohio, to his old workshop where tractors waited under layers of dust. The war had ended, but the ghosts had not. Neighbors said they'd hear him working late at night, sometimes speaking softly to the engines, as if they were old friends. When asked what he was building, He'd only smile and say, "Something that remembers." He never spoke of Normandy again. Years passed and the world moved forward. The war that had once consumed every breath became history. Tidy paragraphs in textbooks, black and white images in museums. But in quiet corners of Europe, the machines that Harold Keller had resurrected still stood. Rusted, forgotten, buried in barns or fields, yet when touched, they still carried the marks of his hands. The faint engraving of a single letter, K, scratched into metal that had once defied death itself. In 1948, engineers from the newly formed U.S. Ordnance Department came to study wartime field repairs. Among the thousands of reports they sifted through, one name kept appearing in the margins: H. Keller, Unconventional Methods. Normandy sector. They found sketches of bizarre hybrid engines, photos of improvised fuel lines and rebuilt pistons made from scrap. What they discovered was more than clever mechanics. It was a blueprint for survival under pressure. Keller never patented his ideas. He never sought recognition, but his techniques became the backbone of a new philosophy of engineering, the belief that in the field, ingenuity mattered more than perfection. That doctrine would later echo through Korea, Vietnam, and every modern battlefield where soldiers face the same cruel truth. Machines fail. But men must not. Back home in Ohio, Keller's workshop became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Young mechanics would visit him, hoping to learn his secrets. He rarely spoke about the war. Instead, he taught them something simpler: that machines were alive only when you respected them. "Every engine breathes," he'd say, resting his hand on cold steel. "You just have to listen long enough to hear its heart." He lived alone, surrounded by tools and the smell of oil, until 1962, when a heart attack took him quietly in his sleep. The local paper gave him 3 sentences. Harold Keller, World War II veteran and mechanic, died at his home yesterday. He was 49. There was no mention of Normandy or of the lives his hands had saved. The world had already moved on to rockets, satellites, and jet engines. His story was nearly lost, but history, like steel, remembers the marks of those who shaped it. In the archives of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a faded report still bears his signature. It describes his work in Normandy as a decisive factor in restoring mobility under fire. The language is cold, bureaucratic, but between the lines lives something deeply human. A man who fought not with a rifle but with a wrench. A man who built hope out of wreckage. In 1994, during the 50th anniversary of D-Day, a retired colonel stood before a rusted Sherman tank at Omaha Beach. On its engine block, faint but visible, was the letter K. The colonel ran his hand over it and whispered, "You kept us moving." No cameras recorded the moment, no speeches followed. Just the wind and the whisper of waves rolling over a beach that once burned with fire. And maybe that's how Keller would have wanted it. Not as a hero remembered in marble, but as a quiet echo in the machines that still stood, defiant and alive, because his story was never about fame or medals or history books. It was about something greater, the relentless, unbreakable will to make broken things live again. In every engineer who refuses to give up, in every soldier who fixes the unfixable, in every person who looks at chaos and sees possibility, Harold Keller still breathes. He taught us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the sound of a wrench turning in the dark, the steady rhythm of a man who believes that if things can move, then there's still hope. And perhaps that is the true miracle of D-Day, not just the landing or the victory, but the countless unseen hands that kept the world turning when it could have stopped. In the end, Harold Keller's life reminds us of something timeless, that history is not built by generals or presidents alone, but by ordinary people who, in the hardest moments, refuse to let the engine die.